Hi, everyone. It's a pity I don't get to see you at GOR this year, but let's hope for better days next year, perhaps. I want to tell you today about a smartphone app that we used in the Netherlands to get better official statistics for travel behavior. This was a study that's joined with Danielle McCool, Barry Schouten, Laurens Smeets, Ole Musman and Victor Verstappen of all of Statistics Netherlands or Utrecht University. All right, so here you see a map of the Netherlands. You may find your own favorite holiday spots or see the big cities of the Netherlands. And all the gray lines here are travels, trips that people took over a period of a week. And you see that this is a lot of trips between the big cities, but you also see a lot of trips going to Germany, Belgium, even some overseas. I want to tell you a bit about how we measured all of this using a smartphone app and what the quality of these data are. Why did we use an app? So first of all, normally we use paper and pencil or web diaries to get people's travel statistics. We know that these diaries suffer from a lot of problems. First of all, they're quite burdensome from respondents. There are a lot of recall problems, people forgetting trips. And the idea of using an app is that we can get much more fine-grained data. We can eliminate a lot of the recall problems, and we get automatic estimation of trip durations, for example. We also wanted to generally test how data collection with an app would work. So how do we design it how do we design the fieldwork procedures? All right, so how did we set this up? So first of all, we sent a random sample of people in from the Netherlands a letter. In that letter, they found a link to our app that was available for both Google and Apple. And the letter also contained a username and a password so that we could track who was answering to our app survey and who wasn't. So when people downloaded the app and they would tick on it the first time, the first thing they needed to do is to log into the app. And that's what you see here on the left. After logging in, they would have to allow us permission to track them using GPS and Wi-Fi sensors. And after this, they would be shown 5 separate videos that would explain to them how the app would work. I'm not showing you the videos because that's too complicated giving the whole video setup here. So here are some screenshots. So the idea of the app is the following. So people just leave it on the phone. They don't have to do anything. And the app would automatically track where people are, and it would populate a diary. So on the left-hand side, you see a couple of days. And if respondents would now click on one of those days, tap on one of the days, they would get to the middle screen where you see the day being divided into stops. So where people are in the same location, and trips, which is travels between 2 locations. You also see some tick marks here. So these are stops or trips where respondents actually gave us more information about what this stop was about or the trip was about. You also see some pencils. So these are locations or trips where the respondents did not yet, at least, give us extra information. So what kind of extra information did we ask for? So we had some questions about the day. So this is at the top of the page, you can see. And then we asked respondents, was this a normal day? Did anything special happen? Did you have your phone with you all the time? Were there any technical problems, etc.? If respondents would click on a trip or a stop, they would get to new screens where they could provide information about the transport modes, could give a name and a reason to a stop. And this is important because we can use these labels to say something about the trips, right? We can identify, we can use the labeling to know about whether our stops and trips detection is okay, yes or no. Okay, participation patterns. So we started the survey at the end of October 2018. We sent invitation letters, and what you see here on the y-axis are just the ID numbers of people that participated. So what you see is that soon after we send it out, most people started the study. The black dots here are hours where we receive data for that particular respondent. So you see a lot of black lines, meaning that respondents kept the app on their phone for a while, usually a week, because that's what we asked them. And then you see a lot of the lines going white, meaning the app is turned off, or you see a lot of intermittent data being sent. You also see that we use some reminders. So you see some bump in the response pattern here. But also, I hope that you see that we have a lot of missing data, right? So the data are not always complete, and I'll return to that issue in a minute. So the general question is, what is the quality of all this data? Here I'm showing you a map of Utrecht to explain you how we detect stops and trips. So imagine a person is just going about his daily business. Here you see a lot of the red dots, which are individual measurements that we took of someone's location. So here the person is quite stationary, he's probably moving about the house. And here we define a stop as being in the same location within a radius of about 50 meters for a certain period of time. And for that, we use 2 minutes. We use other settings as well for the radius and the time, but we found that the settings were not, the way we detected trips was not really sensitive to these settings. So you also see that this is now a stop, what we circle in black. You also see that the person at some point moves away, and this is then a trip. So how good are these stops and trip data? We have these automatically detected stops and trips. We also have the labels from the respondent, right? So what we're interested in is in the cases where we think that there's a trip and the respondent says there wasn't a trip. So this could be because our stop algorithm is not good. And the respondent can hear comments, right? So he can give a label to a stop and say this wasn't a stop. There was a button for that. The reverse can also be true, right? So when the respondent thinks, oh, I made a trip, but it's not given in the app. This is problematic, of course, and it could be caused by the respondent not bringing his phone on a trip, by technical issues, for example. And the respondent can hear, has to tell us in the daily overview, right? There were technical problems with the app or trips were missing. Again, there were buttons there. So we're interested to see how many of these false positives or false negatives we have in comparison to the true positives, where there is a real trip, and true negatives where there was no trip. So for this, we have to rely on the labelings of the stops and trips. So first of all, let's look at how many of these stops and trips are actually labeled. So for the stops, we find many of them are labeled. So you see here in this graph that there's a spike at 100%, meaning that a lot of respondents labeled all their stops. Great. For the trips, less so. And we think the reason for that is that the feedback that respondents received on the labeled stops and trips was not as obvious for the trips as it was for the stops. So here we find a much more uniform distribution, which is a pity because we can only use the trips and the stops that were actually labeled to say something about the quality of the data. All right, so what do we have? An overview of the data. We have 1,900 sampled individuals, about 670 respondents, 450 what we call complete diaries. This all adds up to about 4,800 person days worth of data. 5,200 stops, of which 80% are labeled, and about 18,000 trips, of which about 5,000 are labeled. All right. First, let's start with the false negatives. So this is where the respondent thinks there was a trip, but we don't find it with the GPS. So first of all, I want to look at the missing data episodes and then look at the respondent comments to detect how often this happened. The missing data episodes. So here, I showed you this graph earlier. What we found is that on average, for a respondent, we have 12.8 hours worth of GPS data per day, meaning that's only slightly more than half, which is not very good, right? So there's actually quite a lot of missing data, and there's a big risk, of course, that in these periods where there was missing data, that the respondent actually undertook some trips. Then we looked at the length of this, what we call the gap. So the gap is the time that we have missing data. Here we find, fortunately, that most of the gaps are very small, right? Very short periods where we have missing data. So this could be because of a loss of signal for whatever reason. We also find, however, that some of the gaps are longer, and especially if the longer the gap time is, of course, the worse it is for our statistics. We also looked at when do these gaps occur over the course of a day. And here we find that for both Android and iOS that most of the gaps start at around midnight. So this is when respondents go to bed, they leave their phone and the phone goes into doze mode. Phone goes into sleep as well, doesn't do anything. And then when people wake up at about 7 or 8 o'clock, we see that the phones start again. So a lot of the missing data episodes that we have are overnight. So this makes it maybe less of a problem because we think that most respondents don't do a lot of travels overnight. Do we have problems with battery levels? So here you see the battery levels on the y-axis from 0 to 100. We find no. So the black graphs here show battery levels of individual respondents. We find that only in a very few cases it touches 0. So most respondents really recharge their battery on time, which is what we asked. Okay, so yes, we do have a lot of missing data. Do we also find that respondents comment on this? Do they say that there were trips missing? Here we're relying on the roughly 3,800 daily questions that were completed. So this is 80% of all the daily questions that respondents had. There we received 2,000 answers to the questions, was there anything that you would like to report, extra trips? And there we find that all in all, about 10% of respondents on these given days say that there were problems. So this is quite a big problem. Well, I'm not sure if it's big or small, you may decide for yourself, but it's at least a bit of a problem that we're missing some trips here. Then the reverse, the false positives. So are there trips being labeled erroneously? Here we find that for both the trips and the stops, respondents find very few stops and trips that are erroneous trips, so false positives. This is not so much of a problem. The false negatives are though, and what we find, the main reason for that is, first of all, this missing data is a problem, but the second problem we have is that it's very hard to define what a stop actually is. So when we, for example, think that if someone drops off his or her kids at school, we may not think that that is a stop. The respondent may actually say, no, but that was a stop. It was on my way to work, but it was a separate thing. And the same may happen if you talk to your neighbor on the street, right? We may not detect it as a stop, but the respondent may say so. However, if we could take more liberal rules for defining what a stop is, but then we get into problems when someone is, for example, in a traffic jam or even waiting for a traffic light, right? Because these are short stops as well. And we think that the respondent would say, well, this is definitely not a stop. And we don't want to have all these kind of stops in the app, because then we get a lot more false positives. So this is really a problem of designing an app like this. So we're working on this for a future iteration of this survey. So we're fielding this again next year with the idea of now really making official statistics. We're also using the same app for the budget survey and for the official time use survey next year. And what we're doing is we're really putting a lot of effort into fixing the missing data. So there is a strong need, we feel, to impute the missing data episodes, and that's what we're working on. All right, thanks for attending my talk. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.